I'm indeed researcher at the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at Amsterdam UMC. And as a researcher, I'm also associate editor at 2 journals, Public Health Nutrition and Health and Place. And I'm also a reviewer for many journals, as you tend to be as a researcher. It's kind of a side job. You're not paid to do it, but it's essential for, the quality of good research. So I have quite a bit of experience with reviewing, and I think it's good to mention that peer reviewing is really something that you do with a personal style. So, I'll give you some tips and tricks today, but I think it would be very different from how others do their peer review. This is not, the way to do it. Just some tips and tricks from my side, from my experience as a peer reviewer and associate editor. Feel free to interrupt me, but don't do it in the chat because I won't be able to see what's happening. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself and interrupt me. And otherwise, we have time for some discussion afterwards, I guess. So I'll just provide you with some tips and tricks on how to structure the peer review, what to put in it, and also, your tone of voice and how to be helpful for others in the field. I don't think we have the time, but if there's a little bit of time, I can start a live peer review with you with an article that I have ready here. Just a little bit about the importance of peer review. You as a researcher are invited to judge on the work of your fellow researchers as a peer reviewer. And that is really a crucial, essential part of science, that we have this kind of quality check. And without good peer review, we have an increasing amount of research that is not valid and not replicable. Which is very problematic for the evidence base. So I think we should take peer reviewing very seriously. That does not mean that as a more junior researcher, you shouldn't do it, because I think it's very important that you get the experience to do that. By the way, the only way to get invitations to become a peer reviewer is to ask your supervisors and more senior colleagues to put your name forward. So do that if you're interested to do that. But in any case, I think, you should take it seriously, because it's a really important step towards bringing science to the public. And we should be convinced as a scientific community that this science is actually sound. So my first tip is to actually use the reporting guidelines that are available already. So if you're writing a article yourself, you hopefully use reporting guidelines. You check the Equator website to check what are the reporting guidelines for your case control study or for your RCT. And I find it quite helpful to have a look at those reporting guidelines while doing a peer review, just to see if those, kind of mandatory information is actually present in the article. What I find very important is to keep in mind that you should peer review in a way that you would like to receive peer review reports from others as well. So I get tons of peer review invitations, but I only accept those to which I think I have the expertise I can judge about the article. I find it very annoying if my work is getting peer reviewed by people who have no experience whatsoever in the field. Because that's just very inefficient, to having to explain the methodology, etc., etc. So yeah, I think that's one first aspect. Although very, very few journals require you to sign your peer review report with your name under it, I would always suggest to pretend that you have to put your name under it. And this prevents that you are making nasty remarks about the quality of the study. But it also makes sure that you write something constructive and that you're proud about what you will have written, and that you would be fine with having this peer review report out in the open and public with your name under it. Obviously, it's time consuming to do a peer review. and you should take your time, especially because it's so important to do this quality check of research. So I think it's important to be kind and constructive to the authors. You like others to be kind and constructive about your work, so please do the same for others as well. Also, if you're reading a paper and you think, wow, this is just really well written, great setup of the study, just say so. You don't have to write a lengthy peer review report. If it's good, don't be afraid to say so. Obviously, if things can be improved and you feel it's important, you should also say so. But yeah, don't be afraid to say if it's good. You know, nothing is more annoying than receiving a chaotic peer review report with comments that are all over the place, no structure whatsoever. So I always recommend to use a clear structure, for example, with, you know, numbered bullet points, and also a distinction between major and minor comments, which I think is also helpful for an editor to decide how problematic some of the issues are raised by reviewers. And I also recommend to put some supportive and positive comments, for example, that it's whether it's a contribution to the field, whether they've cited, you know, important references, whether the setup of the study is strong, etc. I think it's good to balance some of your constructive criticisms with positive comments as well. So in terms of how you should do this process, so usually when you accept a reviewer, an invitation to review a paper, you receive the PDF version, which then allows you to read the full article. And my process is then to read the paper actually two or three times with a little bit of time in between. I cannot do a full peer review, you know, just by looking at the paper once, writing down some comments and submitting it. I do tend to take a little bit of time to have a mental pause and reflect on what I've written and what I've read. So when I read a paper for the first time, I just, you know, read it a bit more globally, scan it a bit, and note down my initial judgment, just my initial idea about whether it's innovative, whether the research question is relevant, what, you know, methods that they used, if it seems that they are appropriate. Then I put the paper away for a little bit, and then after a while I read it for a second time, and I read it really into much more detail, have a look at, you know, whether they define a gap in the literature, whether they use the right references, whether they use the right methodology, you know, decisions about cutoff points, things like that. And after reading a paper in a little bit more detail, I try to summarize it for myself in a couple of sentences. What was the aim? What did they find? And also, what are strengths and weaknesses of the paper? And then, you know, I usually put the paper away again, and then a third time I would read the paper in detail again to, you know, just to validate my initial judgments based on the first two times, and then provide more detailed feedback. You know, when I'm peer reviewing, I also, I mean, the most important thing is to highlight potential major flaws in the paper, but whilst you're at it, I tend to also give some minor feedback, such as, you know, spelling mistakes or a reference that they could add, or, you know, some things at the table. It's not mandatory. I mean, it's not your job to have a look at spelling mistakes, but, you know, I think while you've noticed them, it's just as easy to mention them as well as minor comments. So obviously the first thing to assess in a paper is whether, you know, the paper is readable, very important. If the English is, you know, horrible, or you're not able to understand anything about the paper, you know, you may as well stop your peer review and just inform the editor about this. But also, you know, usually papers are readable, because otherwise the editor wouldn't have forwarded them to peer reviewers. So then your job is to see if there's not a major flaw in the study that would actually, you know, make you reject the paper based on this major flaw. So what is a major flaw? I mean, I would tend to say that the findings suggest A, and the reviewers make a completely different conclusion that shows something about B, you know, just not correct interpretation. But also sometimes, you hopefully you think it wouldn't happen, but sometimes authors have just used the incorrect methods. And those are things to, search for first. If those major flaws are present, I usually tend to think there's no much use in providing a lot of feedback about minor details. I would just write in my report that there's a major flaw and that this is a reason to not publish the study. I also want to mention here that it's quite important to read the acknowledgement section of a paper. And this, I mentioned this because of potential conflicts of interest that may have arisen in writing the paper. I do research on food environments and nutritional intake, and I tend to be a little bit more critical and wary about papers that report that the study was funded by a food industry actor, for example. And I think it's important also if you're, I don't know, in pharmaceutics or in medicine, if there is a pharmaceutical company sponsoring the study, I think it's important to know that before you start reading the paper. So I think it's important to read the funding and acknowledgement section before you start peer reviewing as well, to have that information in the back of your mind, whether it's an objective funder or private or a commercial company that has potentially an interest in the findings of the study. Yeah, and then some more practical tips in terms of how to approach this with different sections of the article. Some of the questions I ask myself is, for example, in the introduction, did it become clear to me why it was necessary to do this study? Why is it relevant? What societal problem does it address, or what scientific problem does it address? And what I tend to see in some articles is that the authors try to answer a research question that is not really adding something to the literature, or that they have this rationale for the study that does not reflect what is already known. So they do not really reflect accurately what is the current state of the knowledge and what is the research gap. So that is the question I tend to ask myself for the introduction. Then in the method section, obviously the most important thing is to assess whether the methods were appropriate for answering the research questions, and whether the methods are written in such a way that you can actually, almost replicate the study, because they've lined out the steps that they've taken, the decisions they've made. It's clear how they operationalize the variables. It's clear why they did certain analyses. And this is also a reason why it's important to not accept an invitation to peer review a paper in a field that you're completely, not knowledgeable about, because then you would probably not be able to assess whether the methods are appropriate for answering the research question. One major issue I tend to look for is whether the authors actually had ethical approval for their study and whether participants provided informed consent. Obviously, in many areas, this is mandatory to report, but sometimes, authors forget about it, or they actually, in fact, did not get ethical approval while they should have. So this is also just something to check. Sometimes, the methods people have used are obviously resulting in some kind of bias. For example, if the study was a study among children in classrooms in schools, so there's the data is actually clustered. There's clustering of the children within classes and the classes within schools. This requires a multi-level analysis. If the authors have then just done a regular regression analysis, I would at least want to hear from the authors, well, we tested whether multi-level analysis was necessary, but this was not the case, and therefore we did normal regression analysis. Otherwise, I would just write down in my peer review report, with this clustering of data, multi-level analysis is probably more appropriate. So I would either like to see the results from a multi-level analysis and have it reported in the study, or hear from the authors why they opted not to do that. And, methods are really critical for the quality of the study. So yeah, I tend to be most critical about the methods that authors have used. Obviously, important question when you get to the results section: are the results presented clearly, and are the results interpreted correctly? So sometimes you have a study that looked at 20 or 30 different associations, and they had one significant association, and they don't report all the insignificant associations in the tables. Well, to me, that's a bit problematic. I would want to see, all the methods that are described in the methods section. I would want to see the results from that in the results section, and not just a selection of that. But also what sometimes happens is that people present results for which they have not presented methodologies in the methods section. So that is also a bit problematic. And often you see that those results that they then present are actually not very helpful in answering the research question. Yeah, and obviously sometimes it's also important to have a look at how the authors interpreted effect sizes, directions, etc. Whether they thought the effect size was big or not. It's also good to be critical about that. Then obviously in the discussion section, you would want to see an answer to the research question posed in the introduction, which is surprisingly often missing. So do look for whether the authors actually answered the question. And most important in the discussion is obviously whether it's a careful reflection of the findings. So critical about their own methods, a good comparison with what is already known in the literature, and also very importantly, good reflection on the potential biases that may have confounded the results. So what like major issues that I tend to come across quite a bit is that the authors do not acknowledge the most important limitations. They make this mandatory list of 3 limitations, and then they leave out the most important one. Residual confounding, selection bias of the sample. And I think in mentioning strengths and limitations, I always tend to look for bias due to selection, bias due to information, and bias due to confounding. And obviously bias due to selection has to do with the sample, bias due to information with the measurement instruments used, and bias due to confounding, is with regard to confounding. What also often happens is that authors incorrectly interpret results, for example, with this example of assessing 20 or 30 associations, finding one significant association, and then the whole discussion is about this one significant association. Obviously, that's not a very, balanced discussion of the findings. So that is important in the discussion section, I find. Yeah, then about language. It's a bit difficult. Many researchers in the world have, for them, the English is not their first language. So it's normal that people make, spelling mistakes, or the English is not too great. In, rare cases, I reject a paper because I just don't understand the English at all. And then I report back to the editor and I say, well, I would recommend you to ask the authors to improve the English language, and I would be happy to review again. But at this point, I just cannot. In other cases where language could definitely be improved, but it's still readable, I would tend to peer review the paper in any way, and make a comment to both the authors and the editor that I think the English should be improved to improve readability, to make sure that the message from the research, from the science, is conveyed correctly to the readers. You don't want to, it's also a bit of a waste of research money, research time, if then a publication is not well written. So it's probably good to suggest some improvements in language. I tend to not correct all kinds of spelling mistakes. I find that a waste of my own time. And yeah, I think it's not really up to a peer reviewer to change all the language in the manuscript. So how do I build up my peer review report after, going through this process of asking myself questions and seeing what the authors have reported? I tend to summarize the paper. What did I find? And this is often quite interesting because sometimes authors will actually respond to your peer review, and they would say, well, this is actually not what we did. And then it's a bit problematic because obviously that was my impression of the paper. So I think then there's a bit of a mismatch, and potentially authors should also improve describing what they did if it wasn't clear for me as a peer reviewer. But in any case, I usually spend 2 or 3 or 4 sentences on what the study was about. If I feel that I have lack of, expertise on methodology or the topic or, whatever, I mention it explicitly so that it's clear to the authors and the editor whether I have the full expertise to judge the paper or not. I mentioned early on in my peer review report what my recommendation would be. So major revision, minor revision, immediate reject, immediate accept. I always start with, positive aspects of the study. Sometimes it's just clear that the authors have used an enormous amount of energy and time and resources to conduct the study. And I think it's nice to actually compliment the authors about that, because we all know how, difficult it can be to collect your data and get ethics approval, etc., etc. But also, if they have nice figures, it's easy to say something nice to authors. Just, use your imagination and be positive in your report. I then mentioned those major flaws. I make sure that I explicitly say, well, I've enjoyed reading the paper. It was about this and this and this. I recommend major revisions. Although this and this and this was good about the paper, I think there are 2 or 3 major flaws about the study that should be addressed in order to, for the publication to be acceptable for publication. And then I mentioned those major flaws numerically as well, so that it's easy to respond to them for the authors. Then I usually have a list of some more minor flaws. I don't know, smaller issues that I think are worth mentioning, that are easy to change by the authors and really improve the manuscript if they would do that. And then, you could always end by making some suggestions that are not mandatory, but you think, well, this could improve the paper. It's just sort of your suggestion to do that. For example, sometimes, with regard to language, I make some suggestions, but I tell the author, this is just my suggestion, so feel free to ignore it, but it could be improved if you write this and this and this. And I don't really make it explicit that this is just a suggestion and no deal breaker for me as a peer reviewer. That was this part. But I think it would probably be wise to not do a live peer review session and have a little bit of time for questions and then go to the next presentation.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Thank you for your talk. Are there any questions from the audience? If not, then I have a couple of questions. You said in the beginning that you have a little bit of time in between. I do get the question. Oh yeah, that's all.
Yeah, no problem. I'll share the slides with you.
Right. In the beginning, you said that you have a little bit of time in between, like you read it once, then you leave it again, and you read it twice, etc. But how long do you leave it then? Like for a day or for a week, or because there's also a deadline when you need to hand in the peer review.
Yeah, but that's actually something I want to respond to also. I mean, you get a deadline, but it's not a hard deadline. If you want to do a good peer review and you're short of time, you can always email the editor back and ask for an extension. That's fine. But in any case, obviously, it's good to have a deadline, because otherwise you'd, never finish it at some point. I tend to leave it at least 1 day between my reads. But it depends a little bit on my schedule. Sometimes I just have a very busy week. I start with reading on Monday, and then I have another, 30 minutes on the Wednesday, and then the week after. So I do schedule it in my, in my Outlook agenda. I just block, you know, an hour or 2 hours for peer review in my agenda, so that I also get a reminder when I'm working, like, now is the time to read the paper again. So in total, I mean, it depends on the paper, how difficult it is. And, you know, sometimes you see this, whether that it's unreadable or it has a major flaw, and then actually you're finished quite quickly. But if it's a, you know, potentially good paper, but has, you know, a lot of complex things in it, it may take me, I don't know, up to 5 hours to do a good peer review session. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I was wondering, how do you feel about if you provide major revisions for a paper? Do you think that the author should always accept the major revisions and change the manuscript accordingly? Or do you think it's possible for the author to, for example, not agree with your major revisions and explain why? And would it be possible to still accept the paper?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, that's the best thing, right? That you have a good scientific discussion. Obviously, I don't know everything, and the same goes for other reviewers. And potentially, I mentioned, well, you know, this is a major flaw; it should definitely be changed. And then the authors respond, well, we've actually considered that, but it's not possible because of this and this and this. Or they say, well, you know, we disagree because we have these and these and these insights from our research group. Yeah, completely fine. Sometimes what I do find very annoying is if authors do not respond to my major flaws, and then they write a response letter and then they just ignore this major comment of me. Well, then I find that problematic, and I would email the editor saying, well, you know, the authors didn't even respond to my major comment, and I found it quite critical, so please ask the authors to respond to that. But disagreement is totally fine.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Otherwise, I would suggest to go to the second speaker, and then afterwards we could maybe also have another Q&A. If questions pop up, then they can also be asked again to Reintje.
Yeah, sure.
So the next speaker is, as I mentioned, Reitsma, and he will tell you more or have a talk about the journal side of a peer review. So what do they want to be in? What do they want that are in a peer review? So I would like to give the floor to Reitsma.
Well, Francine, thank you very much. Let me see if I can overcome all the technical issues with sharing a screen and then getting it into presenter mode. So hopefully you are seeing my presentation and also now seeing that the slide moves, right?
Yeah, great.
So thank you all for this opportunity, just to give you a bit of insight into the editorial side of, well, actually running a journal. And running a journal is not easy, and it depends on a lot of, well, voluntary work. And an important part of that is the peer reviews done by, well, all of us, all of you. And what I would like to start out with is this quote from a famous allergist from Turkey, Çesmi Akdis, who I think rightfully claims that being a good reviewer makes you a good author. And that's what I've also experienced myself. If you go to the review process from the other side of things, from the editorial side, the reviewer side, you also better understand how your own papers are read, are responded to, and how you can improve that. So in the end, you're also helping yourself, not only the scientific community. So for the coming 15-20 minutes, if you don't remember anything I say, I'm fine with that. Just remember this quote. It's also very good for your own scientific development. So what usually happens is that authors, they send a manuscript to a journal, and then it arrives at the editorial office. And here the first check already begins. because as you all know, every journal has their own instructions, their own, well, peculiarities, so to say. They're never the same, and submitting a paper takes at least half a day if you're not lucky, because you have to fill in all the department where everybody works, etc., etc. But still, people manage to not follow the instructions. So the first check of a paper is basically more a checklist, which is done by a secretary of the editorial office, just checking if everything is done in adherence to the instructions, if the size of the letters, the style, the file type, the references of the figures that are sent in, whether they have a good format and are readable, and whether or not a conflict of interest is included, or at least a disclosure statement. So this is not about the scientific content, but just about how the makeup of your article is. And you would be surprised how many authors get their paper back at this level already. For most, it's apparently very hard to follow instructions. And we also see this often if a paper has been sent to journal A, has been rejected, and then is resubmitted to some other journal. And if we happen to be the other journal, we get the paper in the format of the previous journal, which is not always helpful. So that's also for you very important to look at. Then if the editorial secretary says, okay, this is fine, the checklist is all checked, it goes to the editor-in-chief. And in general, papers make up a journal. So if you are the editor of a journal, you want to bring in good quality papers, because that will make your journal a good quality journal. And the list that is here is actually quite straightforward. It doesn't take much brain to understand, but editors look for paper that describe topics relevant to the scope of the journal. And also whether the topic is at this time a little bit of a hot topic. Is it significant clinically, or maybe if you are in basic research, does it add anything? Is it unique, or is it the version 20 of a certain trick that we have all seen by now? An editor eyeballs the paper just for the major findings, and are they a bit supported? And if you do basic research, can we make a translation already to also in vivo situations? Or is it really research just for the sake of research? It depends, of course, on what kind of journal you run. I'm from the more clinical side of science, although we also publish a lot of basic science. But for us, a bench to bedside translation is one of the items that we aim for. And then if you make it really into general criteria, then the editor eyeballs, well, what about the selection of subjects? Was the setting good? Has any of this been published prior? Is that appropriately acknowledged? And does there seem to be an apparent conflict of interest? Because that would be all reasons for the editor to already say, okay, this is not what I'm looking for, and I will give a direct reject. I don't know if you are aware of this, but most journals have a certain acceptance rate. And of course, the higher impact factor journals tend to have higher rejection rates or lower acceptance rates. And most of this acceptance rejection rate is already made up by the first editor decision. So an editor has a chance to say, okay, I'm sorry, this is just not good enough for my journal, or it's a very good study, but not for the scope of my journal, or whatever reason, I'm going to direct reject. The upside of that is that the authors have a very quick response, and they don't have to wait for months before they know what happens to their manuscript. But then if an editor says, well, maybe this is something. Oh, and this is also what they look at, of course, you eyeball the abstract, the conclusions, and in general, is the text well written, but not very in depth, because that's the role of the reviewer. So if the editor thinks, okay, this is a possible good paper for my journal, then you start inviting reviewers. So this is where you are all getting an email, which in whatever form will sound like, dear colleague, could you please review this paper for me? And as we have heard from the previous speaker, this is where your thinking should start. Am I the right person to do this? Am I somewhat an expert? And am I able to do it in the coming days or weeks? And do I have any conflicts of interest? Although, of course, deadlines are always flexible, it is very, very convenient if you at least send your answer quickly. Because if an editor has to wait for weeks before all the selected reviewers send in answering, yes, I will do it, or no, I will do not, or after 2 weeks you get all, no, I will do not, and you have to start looking for new reviewers, this is all lost time. So this decision you could make rather quickly. It should take you, well, 30 to 60 seconds if you know what your expertise is, if you know what your calendar is for the coming 2 to 3 weeks, if you know what your conflicts of interest could be. This is not a difficult question. So in whatever form the specific journal handles this, sometimes you click a link in your email, sometimes you have to log into the system and say, yes, I will, or no, I cannot. But please be quick here, because if an editor gets a lot of, no, I cannot, then he can start looking for new ones, of course. And then if you say, yes, I will, it is good to keep, well, in mind a 2-week deadline generally. You see that more and more journals are challenged to get quick review, short times before a paper gets accepted. It depends a little bit on the field of work you're in, but I think it's not really nice for authors to have to wait 3 months after putting it is rejected. I think we should do better than that. And if you know, when you start here, I'm really the right person to do this, but it's not going to happen in the coming 2 weeks, just email the editor. That's no problem, but keep communicating about that. That helps a lot from the editorial side. So say you agree to do the review, plan it, like we heard before. Remember, it's also good for your own training. And then depending on the journal you have, they generally is a certain division of structure for your review report. And you have to follow that structure and try to fill in all those fields. I will show some examples later. For our journal, we try to ask our reviewers not to give an opinion about the decision. So you can, of course, give positive, constructive feedback, saying what you liked about the paper. You can also say what you did not like about the paper, but try to constrain or restrain from saying, I would accept this or I would reject this. And why is that so? As an editor, you will get a number of reviews back, at least 2, if you're lucky, 4. And if one of them says, I should accept it, and one of them says in the text, I should reject it, authors will find some ground to claim that the editor should do this or that, while in the end, it's the editorial decision to be made. So be nice and constructive, as the previous speaker also remarked. And if you're able, number your remarks, please, because then the rebuttal letter that the authors have to write can also be numbered and you can find things back easily. If I would have to summarize my talk into 1 slide, apart from the statement that being a good reviewer makes you a good author, it would be this slide. Basically, what we look for is that you help us. I mean, the editorial task will be to make a decision on the manuscript, which can be an acceptance, a revision, or a rejection of the paper. If you get a good review back from 2 to 4 reviewers, this will help in choosing the right decision. Then, obviously, if you are a good reviewer, you will also help the authors of the paper to improve their manuscript. So you are helping them, you're doing them a favor. And if, unfortunately, a paper should be rejected. If you write a good review, hopefully the authors will better understand why their manuscript is rejected. So in order to do that, you should be able to provide the following. First of all, you write an understandable review, and it's not aiming to, so to say, burn down the paper, to totally destroy it. Even if it is really bad, always try to remember I'm aiming to improve it. I'm aiming to help the authors and to improve the paper. And you can do that. You can be really friendly and still say that something is not too good and how it should be improved. The second thing that you really have to learn when you start out doing reviews is make a suggestion for the decision. If possible, leave it out of the text that goes to the authors, but there's always some place where you can highlight your suggested decision for the editor. And the thing you really have to learn is don't be afraid to advise the editor to reject. Depending on the journal, of course, the acceptance rate will vary, but generally it's always below 50%. So that means that more than half of what you review should be rejected because there's just not enough room for it. So don't think you're not being nice if you're rejecting a paper. You're being very nice if you reject it on the good grounds. If you have reviewed it and there are too many flaws, or it's just not the right paper for the journal or whatever, if there's a good reason to advise or reject, don't think you're being a bully. You're being scientifically correct to say, well, this I would advise a reject. And that, of course, helps the editor, because if the editor gets back 3 very critical reviews of reviewers that don't dare to click that reject box, then it should be a major revision of a paper that you actually don't want to publish. So that second point is really important. And if I look in my role as associate editor, and I look at what we get back from reviewers, mostly the young reviewers start by accepting everything, and then minor revision, major revision, and it takes a year or 2 before they start rejecting papers. So you can gain 2 years by starting to just reject papers if you think that they should be rejected. And of course, you provide some ammunition for the editor. So just hitting the reject button and if you don't write anything, that's not helpful at all. So how would that look in practice? I've just made some screenshots today of the review system that we have. It's just one of thousands out there, but you can see here that we ask our reviewers to score on a 5-point scale a number of points that are graded with these colors. So what's the significance of the research? Is it original? How's the quality of the data? Do you think it will impact clinical practice, etc., etc.? And by eyeballing this, you can see, this is all red, 1 yellow, 1 orange. This is never going to make it. And then you see the recommendation, acceptance all the way down to rejection. And indeed, this reviewer has suggested a rejection, which you would obviously understand if you look at the colors there. So here you might think, okay, this reviewer has done the editor a great favor because he has judged this paper as not good enough for this journal, you should reject it. But then there is the part where the review is actually written, and this was the review that was attached to it. And that was not very helpful. So these are the subheadings that we use at Rhinology Journal. It's not holy, you can choose other subjects, but generally this helps. If you do some general comments, just like was told before, just start summarizing with what you understand from the paper, then major and minor comments. Always look at the abstract, always look at tables and figures. Also always look at the references, and you have a special field with comments that are only going to the editor, not to the author. Well, you can see this is not helpful. The general comments, no real added value, only old references. You could copy paste this into any paper. This is not specific and not helpful. So now this review didn't do me any favor, because if I send this to the authors, they will be like, wow, we have a suggestion for rejection based on a reviewer that didn't even read our paper. So they both should be there. The suggestion for decision, be bold, dare to reject, but also the text that goes with it. So I have two other examples. I just shrunk it a bit. The text doesn't really matter, but these are two reviewers writing about the same paper. And you see on the left one, general comments, one sentence, some major comments, and then minor, well, see above, abstracts, none, table above, figure, none, references, none. So this is a bit helpful, but not very much. If you look at the other reviewer, you don't have to read all the text. But at figure comments, for example, this reviewer says figure legends are missing. But then the first reviewer said, well, figure comments, I don't have any comments. That's strange, because figure legends, that's quite a thing to see and to read. So I think ideally you would be somewhere in between. It's not always so that a longer review is a better review, but a too short review is always a bad review. Even if a paper is really good, you could say so, but you have to somehow give the arguments why you think it's good and what you like about it, and maybe some limitations or whatever. But even if a paper is perfect and should be accepted directly, you should at least write 10 sentences about it, I think, just as a rule of thumb. So the other thing is, if a paper gets a major revision or a small revision, the revision obviously comes back to the editorial office. And then we will try to ask the same reviewers to review that revision. And this is actually the hardest part. So if you think you are being nice by not rejecting a paper, beware, you will be getting it back. And then you have to still say something intelligent about it. And this is often the hardest part, because now you get into the scientific discussion, because you have deemed that it is good enough to be accepted at some point, but there are major issues that need to be addressed. And now the authors will respond to that. And you really have to study that. So the easy part is to read the comments of the other reviewers. Most of the times you get them as well. And that's really helpful because they have been studying the same manuscript, and I've learned a lot from reading other reviewers' commentaries, because they really sometimes open your eyes to, oh, wow, I didn't even see that. That's very smart. Then you review the rebuttal letter and you check what the authors actually think of your issues, of the changes that you asked for. And very important, they sometimes write, yes, very good point. We have adjusted that in the text, and then don't believe them, basically. Check the text, whether they indeed changed it like they said they have, and whether the changes are enough for you to accept that now your issue is gone or properly discussed or whatever. And then if a lot of revision is done, sometimes the text is not revised fully by the authors. So they start their discussion or their results with what was the previous version, and then some new data or discussion is squeezed in, and then the conclusions are not adapted, for example. So a revised manuscript you should read as a new one, but not fully. So this is really difficult. The good news is that writing the actual review report of a revised manuscript can be done mostly rather short, because you can get back to the point you raised before without having going through it all again. So just to conclude, if you start reviewing, you become a better author, and basically you make our life easier or not. And you should be aware of how you make the life easier, because that also makes you a great reviewer. I would have told you more, but I think given time, I should leave it at that. And I'm really happy to take any questions if you have any.
Thank you very much for this talk. It was really great to hear like the other side of the peer review, and the side of the journal for this whole process, and what they would want with the peer review. Are there any questions from the audience?